Did I scare you? What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and every week I typically sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. However, this week, in honor of Halloween, today I will instead be sitting down and telling you guys a spooky urban legend story whilst I put on some makeup. So if any of the aforementioned content sounds appealing to you, then really the only logical thing would be for you to subscribe to the channel and to join me back here each week for storytelling and makeup putting on application. That's the word I'm looking for. Subscribe to the channel and join me back here for weekly storytelling and makeup application. I do know that I'd sure love it if you did. However, if what I do here is not your thing, that's fine. Feel free to check out the description box before you go, where I've listed some more traditional creators as well as media resources that have covered today's story in a way that is likely catered more towards your particular tastes. But for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's story. All right, so urban legends. Ironically, something that freaks me out more to research than any of the true crime cases that I've ever looked into. Maybe I'm being a baby, but some of them are scary. For context, just in case anyone isn't familiar with what an urban legend is, urban legends are a form of modern folklore. Most of the time, they come in the form of spooky stories or anecdotes that are passed around often by word of mouth. And although most of these stories have wildly obscure origins, multiple different versions, and little to no supporting evidence, they are typically still circulated in a way that makes them seem as if they are believable at the least and factual at most. And even if you don't think you have, chances are you've heard at least a few urban legends throughout your life already. Stories like Mothman, Bloody Mary, Slender Man, ooh, the Licked Hand. You heard that one? That one fucked me up as a kid. But putting my trauma aside, all of those stories are examples of urban legends. Spooky stories passed around over the years as if they're true, even though most of them aren't. Not to say that elements of some of these stories aren't true, like Bloody Mary, for example. It's thought by some that the Mary referred to in that story is Mary Tudor, otherwise known as Queen Mary I of England, whom, ironically, did bore the same nickname thanks to the hundreds of Protestants that she burned at the stake, as well as the additional hundreds that she executed in the wake of the failed Protestant rebellion. But then in other tellings of the story, it's believed that the Bloody Mary being referenced is either Elizabeth Bathory, who was a 17th century Hungarian countess accused of being a vampire after she allegedly tortured and killed around 600 girls and women before bathing in their blood. Or people believe that Bloody Mary is actually Mary Worth, who was a 19th century woman who lived in Lake County, Illinois, and that Mary used to capture and torture runaway slaves in her barn before she was burned at the stake for practicing witchcraft. And then even beyond those theories, there are many other iterations where Mary isn't any of those women. All this to say that although the stories are widely believed to be fictional, they are told and passed along in a way with details that make them seem as though they might just be real. So, I mean, it's no wonder that these stories have captivated people for so many years. With their mysterious origins, their eerie details, and the nagging feeling of, but is it true? That you're left with after hearing them. Not to mention their oftentimes cultural or religious importance. So it's safe to say that whether you believe in them or not, these urban legend stories are likely going to be around for far longer than any of us could even hope to be around, including, but certainly not limited to, our story today. So without further ado, let us delve into the story of the Bunny Man. Hi, sorry, me again. One last thing. Just given the nature of urban legends and what they are, this story was incredibly difficult to research and to gather like cohesive information on, considering the fact that these stories are told differently in different places, that they're mainly spread by word of mouth, and that their origin stories are almost always impossible to track down or corroborate. It's very likely that you may know a different version of this story or of any urban legend that you come across at any given time. So while I feel like I have done my very best to gather as much information as possible and to compile all of that information into one streamlined and cohesive video, I absolutely welcome any additional information or any different iterations that you may know. I implore you to leave them down below in the comments. But beyond that, let's hop into our time machines and head back about 120 years to Clifton, Virginia, circa 1904. So it's been 40 years since the Civil War ended, and in those 4 decades, Virginia has seen a substantial boom in its population. And with more people comes the need for more things like hospitals, prisons, post offices, and even eventually an insane asylum. And yes, I know that that is not the appropriate or politically correct term for such a facility nowadays, but for the sake of this story in particular, it was an insane asylum. Okay? Anyway, so they erect this insane asylum, and not surprisingly, given the non-existent understanding of the importance of one's mental health back then, people were actually pissed when this facility opened. No one wanted to live near the asylum. People were genuinely afraid of the people that were being housed there. And after a while, after these citizens spent some time gassing each other up in their little echo chamber, public outrage towards the mere existence of the asylum became too much for the local government to handle, and ultimately the institution was shut down. However, while this did extinguish one problem, it certainly created a new and arguably bigger one, being where were all of these people living in this asylum supposed to go now? Obviously, they couldn't stay where they were, but they also obviously couldn't just be released. Sure, they shouldn't have been so stigmatized, but these people were unwell. Some of them were completely delusional, and some of them were actually incredibly dangerous. And in that especially dangerous category was a man named Douglas J. Griffin. Douglas was most certainly believed to be, a few cards short of a full deck, and he'd been committed to the asylum after he'd been found guilty of murdering his entire family on an Easter Sunday. So yeah, he's not exactly the type of person you can just let loose onto the streets and hope for the best, right? Well, thankfully, I guess it depends on how you look at it. But following the dissolution of the asylum, arrangements were made for the residents to be transported from the now closed facility to nearby Lorton Prison. So, busload by busload, they began systematically clearing out the asylum and transporting the residents to their new home in Lorton, Virginia. And, this was quite the undertaking. It took multiple trips, multiple busloads of these inmates or patients or whatever you want to call them. They didn't all fit on the bus at once, so they had to make multiple trips. And for the most part, it all went fine. It wasn't until the final trip and the final busload of transportees that tragedy would strike. And I'm not sure, obviously, because urban legend, but I can't say with certainty what happened to cause this next thing, but it's believed that something happened that caused the driver to lose control of the bus, and then it crashed. And this was no, gingerly little fender bender. No, ma'am. It was a bad crash. A gnarly, devastating crash that resulted in the deaths of not only the driver, but also the majority of the passengers were killed in this wreck as well. Out of the entire busload of people, only 10 of the inmates managed to survive. And then in the wake of the crash, those 10 men would disappear. And as you've likely guessed, one of those 10 men was indeed Douglas J. Griffin. Remember the Easter morning family killer? Yeah, him. So he's in the wind now. Him and 9 other inmates from the asylum, and as you'd expect, people in the area were straight bugging. They didn't even want these people locked up in a maximum security facility near them. So you think they want them out running around the wild near them? Hell no. We're talking about the days where someone would rather stick a railroad spike up through somebody's eyelid and into their brain before they would even dream of addressing their mental health condition. So they were absolutely not prepared to unsuspectingly come across someone who was mentally unwell or mentally disturbed. So as word of the crash began to spread, a heavy brigade of police made their way out, and they began one by one rounding up and recapturing the escapees. And I'll give them credit because in pretty rapid succession, they were able to apprehend 8 out of the 10 missing inmates. However, the last 2, well, they were really giving police a run for their money. And these 2 men were Marcus Walster, and the other, I mean, do I really even have to say it? It was so obviously Douglas Griffin, that family killing maniac. And what's really scary is that police, they never recaptured these men. They were never tracked down to be recaptured or reapprehended. Instead, it's believed that they lived off the land in the surrounding forest area, off the grid and away from civilization, all in an effort to evade capture and to remain free. Although, I've seen Prison Break enough times to know that a life on the run is hardly free, but I digress. And you know what? Had the men disappeared into the woods and kept to themselves and never caused any trouble, that would have been one thing. I'm not saying it would have been right. I'm just saying that what they did was, different. So, following the bus crash and Marcus and Douglas's disappearance, the residents in the area began to make some unsettling discoveries, most notably being the skinned and partially eaten rabbits that they began finding hung in trees near Colchester Overpass all along a railroad track. And when this discovery was made, did people lose their ever-loving minds. I'm sure they explored every paranoia point possible when looking for an explanation as to what was going on, from the occult to some sort of satanic ritualistic sacrifice. I imagine their minds went here, there, and everywhere before ultimately their horror and panic led to a massive search effort through the forest to hopefully find and neutralize whatever they were up against. But instead of coming face to face with a circle of chanting men in black robes or a pentagram drawn in blood resting beneath a goat's head, these townspeople instead came across something that I can't imagine any of them were expecting. During their search of the woods is when the townspeople discovered the dead and mutilated body of Marcus Walster. And just like the rabbits that had prompted their search to begin with, Marcus had been killed, skinned, and mutilated before his body was then hung from a tree along the train tracks. And given that no one had seen hide nor hair of him since the bus crash, it was determined that the only logical explanation was that Douglas Griffin, well, it was believed that he was responsible for the bunny corpses as well as for the murder and desecration of Marcus Walster. And as the townspeople stood and stared in horror at what was before them, out of nowhere, that is when they began to hear what I've seen referred to as maniacal laughter coming from the direction of the train tracks. And then, as the blinding light of an oncoming train obstructed their vision, legend has it that some of the people that were there that night were able to see Douglas Griffin for just a split second before he ran, laughing in front of that train. And then, in the blink of an eye, the train struck Douglas, killing him instantly. And because of this being the location of Douglas's death, as well as the location of the majority of the hanging bunny corpses, Colchester Overpass is now famously referred to as Bunnyman Bridge. However, a lot of people don't believe that Douglas Griffin, aka the Bunnyman, well, it's widely speculated that Douglas didn't actually die on that fateful evening. Rather, it's believed that he continued for decades to operate as the Bunnyman, and that he is to blame for missing animals and missing children in the area. And I actually think that locals still blame Bunnyman for some mysterious happenings within the area, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Whatever you believe, though, legend has it that if you find yourself at Colchester Overpass around midnight on Halloween, there's a good chance that you could end up being the next one to be butchered by the Bunny Man. According to Bunny Man lore, the Colchester Overpass to this day remains one of the most dangerous and most haunted locations in Northern Virginia. It's become a famous destination for ghost hunters and paranormal investigators from all over the world. And this is largely in part to the fact that, again, whether you believe the legend or not, there have been real and true documented occurrences of mysterious deaths and supernatural phenomenons that have taken place near or around the bridge. Now again, due to the nature of this story and it being an urban legend, some of the stories I'm about to get into are more vague than others, but it's important to note that some of the stories are 100% real stories. They're documented and they are true. And an example of one of these true stories is the story of Air Force cadet Bob Bennett and his fiancée. Bob Bennett was a first-year Air Force cadet, and he was in town visiting his fiancée as well as attending an Air Force versus Navy football game that had taken place the previous weekend. Where Bunny Man comes into the story, though, well, that part of the story takes place in mid-October 1970. Bob and his woman, sorry, I don't know her name, but at any rate, on this dark and cold night, these two young lovers had pulled over in the 5400 block of Guinea Road to talk. And apparently, as they were talking, all of a sudden, the couple was showered with glass from Bob's vehicle's passenger side window. Obviously, stunned and confused, the two looked over at the window, only to find the blade of a hatchet embedded into the window. And what was even more terrifying was that at the other end of said hatchet stood a man in what appeared to be a large, dingy robe and bunny ears. And then before they could even really process what they were looking at, because let's be honest, that's going to take anyone a minute or two, the man pulled the hatchet back and swung down again for a second time into the window of the car, this time completely shattering it. So obviously at this point, Bob begins to floor it out of there. And as he does, the man in the bunny ears lost hold of the hatchet and he dropped it into the vehicle onto the passenger side floorboard. And as Bob put his pedal to the metal and gunned it out of there, both he and his fiancée report that they heard the man yell at them as they drove away. He yelled at them something along the lines of they were on private property and they better not come back. He told them that he'd taken their tag number down and essentially, in my opinion, he threatened them that if he ever saw them again, that next time he would finish the job, if you catch my drift. And I cannot even begin to imagine how scary this must have been, especially because this is just a couple years after the Zodiac Killer went out on his couple killing spree. So understandably, Bob and his fiancée, once they got out of danger and off of Guinea Road, their next stop, no question, was straight to the police station. They went and they filed a report detailing everything that had happened to them that night, everything I just told you. In fact, the only point in their stories that didn't match up almost word for word was that while Bob swore that he saw bunny ears on the man, his fiancée instead believed that what she had seen was a man wearing a pointed hood with the face portion cut out. Beyond that, though, their stories were virtually exactly the same, right down to the fact that they had both claimed to see their attacker's face. However, neither of them were able to assist police in identifying him. And that portion of this whole legend, Bob and his fiance's story, that's a real story. There are news reports to cover it and everything. And the police even supposedly had the hatchet in their possession at one point. And then 2 weeks after that happened, there was actually another completely factual and real report of a sighting and an encounter with the Bunny Man. Again, this happened on Guinea Road, which, by the way, is roughly 7 miles or so away from Colchester Overpass or the Bunny Man Bridge, just for context. And this sighting in particular happened about a block away from what had happened to Bob and his fiancée. So it was once again late at night when Paul Phillips, who worked as a private security guard for a construction company, claimed to have seen the Bunny Man standing on the front porch of a home that was in the process of being constructed. Paul noted that he saw the man while he was making his rounds that evening, and that when he tried to approach him and to speak to him, that is when the Bunny Man began hacking into the house with a hatchet. Hatchet, axe, I don't know the difference, but I'll probably interchange them, so just roll with me here. But he supposedly hacked into the house a total of 8 times, all while telling Paul that he was tired of people trespassing on his private property. And as Paul continued to approach the bunny man, he then threatened him that if he didn't get out of there, he was going to bust him in the head with his hatchet. And at that point, obviously having just been threatened, Paul retreated back to his car. He went to get his gun and to call for backup. However, by the time he returned, the bunny man had run off into the woods, axe in hand. Unlike Bob and his fiance, though, I don't believe that Paul was able to get a good look at the man's face, but he was able to give a decent physical description of the man. And that was that he was about 5'8", he was 160 pounds, and he was likely in his early to mid 20s. And I know I keep saying this, but I do feel like I have to reiterate that there is in fact a real and tangible report of this on record with the Fairfax County Police Department. I don't know that there's actually a police report on file for what happened to Bob and his fiance, but I do know that there were news sources that covered it. And it's not just these 2 stories. Evidently, there were close to 50 reported cases of run-ins with this lunatic in a bunny suit just from the fall of 1970 alone. And there was a 6-month investigation executed following these reports in an attempt to locate, identify, and apprehend the bunny man. But on March 14th, 1971, after exhausting all possible leads, investigator W.L. Johnson of the Criminal Investigation Bureau wrote the following summary. After a very extensive investigation into this and all other cases of this same nature, it is still unsubstantiated as to whether or not there really is a white rabbit. The only people who have seen this so-called white rabbit have been children of rather young ages and the complainant in this case. Upon interviewing everyone in this case that may have had any knowledge of any incidents concerning a white rabbit, there has been no significant information uncovered that would lead to the identity of the person or persons that were posing as this white rabbit. Therefore, this case will be marked as inactive. And while that is the official statement on record, I did see from a few different sources that as word of what had happened to Paul started to spread, a man actually claiming to be the bunny man himself contacted local authorities, called him up and told him that he did not want the woods to continue being cut down to accommodate all these new housing complexes that were popping up in the area. And at the end of his call, this man supposedly issued a warning that if these construction projects continued spreading into his woods, that there would be consequences. And obviously, rumors of this phone call really greased some wheels within the media, causing stories about the bunny man, new and old, to start popping up nationwide. But before we get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, can Bunny Man Bridge turn anyone into a killer? Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and I left you on a little bit of a cliffhanger. And to refresh your memory, my question was, can Bunny Man Bridge turn a regular, average Joe like you or me into a cold-blooded killer? And that question comes from the story about a man from Clifton, Virginia, who supposedly innocently crossed over the bridge while traveling. And although he survived his journey past the bridge, legend has it that simply coming into contact with Bunny Man Bridge actually caused him to go completely crazy. It's said that when he returned home, he brutally murdered his parents out of nowhere for absolutely no reason. And then the next day, which, mind you, just so happened to be Easter morning, and he did all of this before, punching his own ticket as well. Obviously, this is one of the more vague stories that there is surrounding the legend of Bunny Man, as is the story of 3 young children who were believed to have gone missing, only to later be found hanging dead from Bunny Man Bridge. And legend has it that their bodies had been mutilated and slashed open, much like the rabbits at the beginning of this story. However, these children were all each said to have been found with a note attached to their foot, and each of these notes read, "You'll never catch the Bunny Man. And there are even reports from as recently as 2001 where 6 local students from the area, accompanied by 1 adult guide, they all went into the woods to explore and were horrified when they came across a slew of mutilated bunny parts all throughout the woods. Then, as they continued exploring, that is when they are said to have started hearing very ominous noises before catching a glimpse of a figure lurking near them in the forest. And after this, I guess they skadoodled right out of the woods and never looked back. However, to this day, teens from all over Virginia are said to make the trek to Colchester Overpass or to Bunnyman Bridge in hopes of coming face to face with this axe-wielding psycho. It's become a sort of a tradition for these kids to go on Bunnyman hunts late at night, either to try and scare their friends or, I guess, to prove their own bravery. And putting the legend or whatever aside, am I the only one who thinks that kids out at night on a railroad track doesn't seem that safe? Full transparency, I'm not even really 100% sure if the railroad is even still functional, so I might just be being a big old party pooper. But I just do not think that I would be happy if my kids came to me and were like, hey, we're gonna go out to this old decrepit bridge and see if we can find a murderer in a bunny suit. The fuck you are? Because even if the railroad portion isn't still functional, I know for a fact that people who live in the area still think that it's a safety hazard one way or another. There's even a petition that I found from, I think it was late 2021, that once the bridge either lowered or reconstructed, torn down, I don't know. They want it modified in some sort of way because they said that it restricts access to proper healthcare and emergency services. And in keeping with it being dangerous, these kids are out there at night and there's no sidewalks or shoulders or anything. So apparently if a car comes and you're walking, you have to just jump in a ditch and hope for the best. It sounds good. Oh, and there's also rumors that go around the area that at one point police actually did end up finding the Bunny Man in the woods. They found him and they ended up chasing him all the way to the bridge where he attempted to evade their capture by getting up onto the railroad tracks. But before he was able to escape, he was struck and killed by an oncoming train. The eeriest part of that story, though, is that as he was struck by the train, legend has it that police could hear the Bunny Man laughing. And supposedly that laughter didn't stop, even after the train had sprayed Peter Cottontail all over those woods, which is creepy and also familiar. In my opinion, this is clearly just an alternate version of what happened to Douglas Griffin, but I did see it listed as a completely separate story via a few different sources, so I thought I'd include it. Actually, speaking of Douglas, if you were actively listening, you might have some questions regarding some of the dates that I've mentioned throughout today's story. Mainly that Douglas supposedly either died or evaded capture sometime in 1904 to 1907. However, the majority of the Bunny Man sightings took place in the 70s or later. And that has given a lot of people pause in taking that version of the Bunny Man legend at face value. I guess if he had died that night and it was his ghost that was running amok all throughout the woods dressed as a rabbit, then okay, fine, I guess. But if we're supposed to believe that Douglas managed to survive when police believed he was hit by that train, that would mean that he was, at the very least, in his 90s when Bob Bennett and his fiance were attacked and when Paul Phillips encountered him. And look, I'm not trying to sound ageist, but I don't know a lot of 90-year-olds that could effortlessly wield an axe, let alone outrun a young, able-bodied security guard. Now, that's not to say that it's not possible, just that it's not probable, you know? And honestly, the fact that Douglas would have likely been either too old or too dead to be Bunny Man, that is the least of the gaping holes that are left in the Bunny Man legend once you fact-check that particular origin story. For starters, according to official records, there never actually was an insane asylum in Fairfax, Virginia. Therefore, there were certainly no records of an inmate being housed there by the name of Douglas J. Griffin. Oh, and you know what? Furthermore, Lorton Prison, the prison that the insane asylum inmates were supposedly being transferred to, well, that facility wasn't even built until 1910. So we're talking 6 years after the patients were supposed to have been transferred when the whole bus crash took place. So historically speaking, Douglas J. Griffin escaping a bus crash from an asylum in Fairfax to Lorton Prison, well, that simply did not happen. There's no way around that. That said, though, there is record of a man named Douglas J. Griffin from Virginia. He was born in 1940, and he actually was questioned by police in relation to the 1964 murder of a young girl named June Hollub. I guess she had been one of a few children that had been reported missing in that area around that specific time. And sadly, her body was ultimately found in the woods in Bull Run. And while I don't personally have a lot, or frankly, any information as to why Douglas J. Griffin was questioned about that incident, I do know that he was never convicted. Rather, he was ultimately released due to a lack of evidence linking him to the crime. And once he was set free, he disappeared, never to be seen again. So some people believe that this Douglas J. Griffin is the real Bunny Man. That although he disappeared, he never went far. That he instead went on to terrorize the town as the Bunny Man throughout the late 60s and 70s. As for more recent encounters with the Bunny Man, well, it's my understanding that to explain those, people have started leaning heavily into the paranormal aspect, theorizing that the present-day Bunny Man is actually the ghost of the Bunny Man of decades past. And then another possible origin story that I came across is the story of Charles Holliber. And just to clarify, this is another completely real and true story. So keep that in mind. So it was early 1949 when 37-year-old Frances Holliber and her estranged husband Charles were moving out of a nudist colony in Fairfax County to their old home in DC. Which, a nudist colony? Can we just stop there? Because that is spooky enough. Anyways, at some point on their journey, their vehicle, I guess, became stuck in the mud, which caused Frances and Charles to get into a big argument. Because again, they're estranged, so things between them aren't great. It really didn't take much to get these two hooping and hollering and at each other's throats. So they're pissed, they're fighting, and eventually Frances she's done. She's had enough of this man, enough of his antics, so she snatches up June, their 8-month-old daughter, and she takes off on foot. Charles, on the other hand, he stayed and he slept in the car that night before he then also headed off on foot to DC, where he believed that he would find Frances and June waiting for him. Much to his surprise, though, Frances and June were not waiting for him, nor did they ever show up. So Charles, he is just freaking out at this point. Where the fuck are his wife and daughter? Just wigging out, and rightfully so, I'd suppose. So then his brother-in-law offers to drive him back to where the car had gotten stuck in hopes that that is where Frances and June were. They were hoping that after Frances had cooled off from their argument, she had headed back with their daughter back to the car to meet back up with Charles. And I guess since he wasn't there, they were just hopefully waiting for him to get back. But again, when they got back to the car, Frances and June were still nowhere to be found. So at this point, everyone's worried, leading Charles and his brother-in-law to call police and report Frances and June missing. And luckily, police took this disappearance very seriously, and almost immediately an extensive search involving Fairfax County officers, Washington detectives, and a local Boy Scout troop was brought together. Sadly, though, this search would not end up in a way that anyone was hoping for, because just about 200 yards away from the car, searchers discovered a freshly dug shallow grave. And after digging up the grave, they discovered that it had in fact been dug to conceal the bodies of Frances and baby June. Frances had apparently been mercilessly beaten before, having been shot once in the head and once in the heart. And then it appeared as though baby June, who again was just 8 months old, she was found clinging to her mother, having died from suffocation after being buried alive. Just absolutely heartbreaking and disgusting. And even more unbelievable is that after a full-fledged investigation, Charles would ultimately confess to the murders of his wife and his daughter. And in response, on January 29th, 1950, Charles Holliber was sentenced to death. He was set to be executed via electric chair. However, before this execution could be carried out, Charles' attorney actually filed an appeal, claiming that Charles was obviously not guilty by reason of insanity, and because that had not previously been properly presented to the court, it was impossible to claim that he'd received a fair first trial. And after reviewing the case, the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals actually agreed, and they overturned his conviction and his death sentence pending a new trial. And his second trial would ultimately see him committed to Western State Mental Hospital in Marion, Virginia, where he was formally diagnosed as insane. So yeah, also very similar to Douglas J. Griffin's backstory. The first Douglas J. Griffin, the one who escaped from the bus crash that never happened while being transported from the insane asylum that never existed, that Douglas. It's very similar to the backstory on how he killed his wife and daughter prior to being committed. Basically, it sounds like people married the two stories together. The story of the real Douglas J. Griffin disappearing and the story of Charles Holliber murdering his family. The origin story of the Bunny Man kind of just sounds like a combination of those two stories that people then, over the years, threw a little extra, oomph onto. You know, they added a little of their own pizzazz. Bam, 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 bam. And while I may not believe the sensationalized origin stories, I will say that I most certainly do believe that at one point there was a Looney Tune out in the woods dressed in a bunny suit threatening people with an axe, which is fucking terrifying. My thought process is that someone who, probably had couple of screws loose, heard the Bunny Man story, and then felt inspired to take on the persona. And if you're like, that would never happen, I implore you to remember 2016. You remember when there were, for real, people out roaming around the streets dressed up as clowns, going around and scaring the ever-loving shit out of people? And you don't think some crazy man could throw on a bunny suit and go out acting a fool the same way? Come on. Hi, I'm a pumpkin skull. Skullkin? I don't know. I saw a picture on Pinterest. I liked it. I tried to recreate it. I'm not loving it, but, we're here, so it's what we've got to work with. But enough about me. What do the actual residents of Fairfax believe regarding the legend of Bunny Man? Well, obviously it's a fun, spooky holiday tradition to go out and to look for Bunny Man, which leads me to believe that most people don't really believe the story. Mainly because if they did, I don't think that they'd be voluntarily heading out into the woods to become his next victim. And I've also seen a lot of statements in newspapers and such of people refuting the existence of a Bunny Man. And with having so many variations of who Bunny Man might be, what he was supposedly responsible for, where he came from, I can see why people would be skeptical. Actually, in 1973, Patricia Johnson, who was a student at the University of Maryland, she submitted an essay on the Bunny Man as an assignment for her English folklore class, and out of 30-something students that she interviewed regarding what they knew about Bunny Man, she received over 50 different iterations of the legend from 33 students, meaning that more than one of the students gave Patricia multiple different versions of the story just in one interview, which again makes the whole story really easy to write off. But then on the flip side, knowing that there are so many true stories linked in with the legend of Bunny Man, I don't know. But I can tell you for sure that you won't catch me hanging out around Colchester Overpass tomorrow night at midnight. And you can stake your life on that. Anyways, with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. Do you think that there's any truth to the legend of Bunny Man? Or do you think it's just a spooky story fabricated out of some true events to scare kids around Halloween? I'm very interested to get your opinions down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form I have linked in the description box down below, which is also where you'll find all of the details and products I used in today's video. Not that this turned out anywhere near how I was envisioning, and I really don't see anyone wanting to recreate it, but regardless, the info is down there. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos almost every week. I post for 4 consecutive weeks, and then I take a scheduled skip week, but if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always know when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Oh, and happy Halloween. Bye, guys.